Most beginners pick a fund by glancing at past returns. Few notice a small number tucked into the fund description that quietly shapes their future more than almost any other line on the page. That number is called the expense ratio. It looks tiny. It often appears as a fraction of a percent. But across decades, that small number can quietly change everything. At its core, an expense ratio is the annual fee charged by a fund to manage your money. It is expressed as a percentage of the assets you hold in the fund. If a fund has a 0.5% expense ratio, you are paying half of 1% of your invested balance every year, regardless of how the fund performs. It is quiet, automatic, and continuous. The fee is not billed separately. It is silently deducted from the fund itself. The price of the fund is quietly adjusted each day to reflect the cost. You will never see a withdrawal from your account. That invisibility is part of why expense ratios are so easy to ignore. The cost is real, but the deduction is hidden inside the daily fund value. A useful metaphor is a leaky bucket. Imagine pouring water steadily into a bucket over many years. A small leak at the bottom may seem insignificant at first. The bucket fills anyway, but the same bucket with no leak ends up much fuller after a long stretch of time. That difference, invisible at any single moment, becomes obvious only after decades. A common misunderstanding is that a small percentage cannot matter much. The math says otherwise. Imagine two funds with identical underlying investments. One charges a small fee. The other charges a much larger fee. Over 40 years of compounding, the difference can quietly cost a meaningful fraction of the final balance. The same investments produce very different outcomes due only to that quiet fee. Index funds tend to have low expense ratios because they simply track a basket of investments without trying to outperform the market. Actively managed funds typically charge higher expense ratios because they pay for research, analysis, and decision-making. The hope is that the higher fee is justified by better performance. The reality, on average, is that it usually is not. A hidden risk is that high expense ratios compound just as your returns do, but in reverse. The fee charges a small slice of your balance every year. As your balance grows, the absolute dollar fee also grows. Over decades, this growing leak becomes one of the most expensive features of an otherwise quiet investment. Awareness of this quiet creep is essential. A practical example helps. Imagine investing a steady monthly amount into a broad fund for 40 years. With a very low expense ratio, your final balance might be quite a bit larger than the same amount invested in a similar fund with a higher expense ratio. The actual investments may be nearly identical. Only the quiet annual fee separates the two outcomes meaningfully. For long-term investors, especially those investing in tax-advantaged accounts, expense ratios may be the single most important controllable factor. You cannot control what the market does. You cannot reliably predict which active manager will outperform. But you can read the expense ratio. You can compare it. You can pick the cheaper of two similar funds. That decision is fully within your control. What beginners often misunderstand is the difference between a fund's expense ratio and its other potential costs. A fund may also have sales loads, redemption fees, or transaction costs. The expense ratio captures only the ongoing annual management fee. Reading the full cost structure once before investing is a small step that prevents many slow leaks across your investing life. There is also a psychological angle. Because the expense ratio is invisible day to day, investors often feel as if they are not paying it at all. This is dangerous. Hidden costs do not stop being costs simply because they are silent. Making the invisible visible, once a year, by calculating roughly how much you paid in fees, can quickly motivate better choices. A common mistake is chasing past performance regardless of fees. Many investors look at a fund with strong recent returns and ignore its high expense ratio, assuming the future will look like the past. Performance can fade. Fees never do. A fund that beats the market this year may underperform next year, but its expense ratio will continue charging exactly the same. A practical rule is to set a comfort ceiling for expense ratios when choosing long-term investments. For broad index funds, many thoughtful investors aim for very low fees, often a fraction of 1%. For more specialized funds, somewhat higher costs may be acceptable, but only when there is a clear and specific reason. Cheap is not always best, but expensive without reason rarely is. What to avoid is paying for complexity you do not need. Some funds bundle layers of strategy on top of basic exposure, charging extra fees for features that do not consistently improve outcomes. For most long-term goals, a small set of broad, low-cost funds covers the essentials. Adding complexity rarely helps. Adding cost almost always hurts. A better habit is to include the expense ratio in your normal fund evaluation. When opening a new fund, look at the percentage. When reviewing your portfolio once a year, glance at each fund's expense ratio. If you find a clearly cheaper alternative that holds essentially the same investments, consider switching, especially in tax-advantaged accounts where switching has no tax consequences. Over the long term, low-fee investing is not a clever trick. It is one of the few advantages available to every investor regardless of skill or luck. The investor who quietly chooses low expense ratios, year after year, gives themselves a permanent tailwind. The investor who ignores them faces a permanent headwind. Across decades, those small differences quietly tilt the entire balance. To summarize, an expense ratio is the annual percentage fee charged by a fund. It is deducted quietly from the fund value, compounds against you over time, and varies widely from very low to surprisingly high. It is one of the most controllable factors in long-term investing. Choosing low-cost funds, where appropriate, is a quiet and powerful long-term advantage. The fund itself does not care whether you notice the fee or not. Decades of compounding will simply show the result, with or without your awareness, which is why awareness now matters so much. The final takeaway is gentle. Numbers that look small on a page can have very large effects when multiplied across decades. Read the expense ratio before investing. Prefer simple, broad, low-cost funds for the core of your long-term plan. Over many years, your future self will quietly thank you for the patient attention paid to a few small percentages today. The investor who treats every fractional percent of cost as worth examining tends to build a portfolio that grows with quiet efficiency, free of leaks, while others slowly wonder where part of their returns went. The quiet attention to fees is one of the rare investing skills that costs nothing to develop and pays back across a lifetime.